Think the samurai lived and died by a noble code of honor called bushido? Think again. The truth is, the concept of bushido as we know it today, this rigid, stoic, almost spiritual warrior's code, wasn't something samurai actually followed during their heyday. In fact, it's largely a product of revisionist history, retroactively romanticized centuries later to create a tidy moral framework for a warrior class that was often anything but honorable. During Japan's feudal era, roughly from the 12th to the 19th century, samurai were elite warriors, yes, but they were also political enforcers, assassins, debt collectors, warlords, and at times outright thugs. The idea that they followed a strict code of loyalty, courage, and honor is a beautiful illusion crafted more by poets and politicians than by the swordsmen themselves. The term bushido didn't even become widespread until the Tokugawa era, when Japan was already stabilizing under central rule, long after the era of civil wars and battlefield chaos that made samurai famous. Back when the samurai were truly active, in the Sengoku period, for example, which was one of the bloodiest eras in Japanese history, loyalty was often just a convenience. Samurai would switch allegiances if it suited them, betray their lords if the price was right, and routinely slaughter peasants during power grabs. Honor didn't mean dying for a noble cause. It meant surviving long enough to climb the ladder of influence. Samurai didn't fear dishonor so much as they feared defeat. And when defeat came, some committed seppuku, ritual suicide, but many others simply fled, defected, or waited for a better offer. The Bushido Code, as we popularly understand it today, strict self-discipline, moral rectitude, total loyalty to one's lord, was largely cemented during the peaceful Edo period when there were no more wars to fight. Samurai became bureaucrats and poets, sipping tea and quoting Confucius while romanticizing their violent past. The actual chaos, bloodshed, and opportunism of earlier samurai life were swept under the tatami mat, replaced with cherry blossoms and poetic death haikus. And yet today, Bushido is marketed like some kind of ancient Japanese chivalry, a sacred code passed down like scripture from sword to sword. But just like the European knight's code of chivalry, it was mostly an ideal, not a reality. The real samurai? They were humans, deeply flawed, often cruel, and always pragmatic. The myth of Bushido wasn't forged in fire and combat. It was edited into textbooks and folklore, centuries after the swords were sheathed for good. Forget the image of the noble warrior meditating before battle or engaging in a fair one-on-one duel under a cherry blossom tree. Real samurai life was soaked in blood, mud, and cruelty. Being a samurai didn't mean standing for justice. It meant mastering the art of sanctioned violence. And that violence wasn't clean, glorious, or noble. It was often brutal, merciless, and horrifying. Samurai were not just warriors, they were instruments of war and domination. In times of peace, they acted as enforcers for local lords, collecting taxes, intimidating rivals, and punishing dissent. In times of war, they unleashed hell. Heads were currency, literally. During battles, it was common practice for samurai to decapitate enemies and bring their heads to their commanders as proof of valor. These trophy heads were cleaned, perfumed, and presented formally in post-battle rituals. The more heads you brought back, the more prestige you earned. It wasn't about strategy or discipline. It was about body count. Worse yet, the brutality didn't stop on the battlefield. Samurai were allowed to kill commoners for even perceived disrespect. A practice known as kirisude gomen gave them the right to cut down a peasant on the spot if they felt insulted or disrespected, with zero legal consequence. Imagine living in a society where someone could decapitate you just because you didn't bow deep enough. That was daily reality for commoners under samurai rule. Fear wasn't just a side effect of the system, it was the system. And for all their emphasis on death as a noble release, especially the infamous seppuku ritual, it's easy to forget how horrific that actually was. Seppuku wasn't some graceful fade into the afterlife. It was a slow, excruciating death where the samurai would slice open his own abdomen and spill his guts, literally, onto the floor. The pain was unimaginable. Most couldn't finish the act and relied on a second person, a kaishakunin, to decapitate them mid-scream. There was nothing poetic about it. It was a gruesome, blood-drenched spectacle, one that was expected, applauded, and sometimes enforced for failure or dishonor, even minor infractions. And yet, we still glamorize it. We still tell stories of brave samurai dying by their own blade for honor, as if it was some cinematic triumph. The truth? Most people, if they were honest, would have chosen survival over slicing their intestines out in front of an audience. The only reason many didn't is because the pressure to conform and the fear of bringing shame to their family was stronger than their survival instinct. So no, being a samurai wasn't a path of spiritual enlightenment. It was a job. A deadly, violent job that demanded unwavering loyalty to a master and gave you the power to kill with impunity, as long as it served the system. If you hesitated, faltered, or showed weakness, you weren't just fired, you were expected to die for it. We've been sold the idea that samurai were the ultimate example of loyalty, devoted servants who would die before dishonoring their masters. But here's the truth no one tells you. In the real samurai world, loyalty was a loaded gun pointed at your own head, and everyone else was holding the trigger. The ideal of bushido, the so-called way of the warrior, preached unbreakable allegiance to one's lord. But in practice, loyalty was as flexible as political necessity demanded. Samurai often switched allegiances, betrayed their masters, or turned on allies the moment it suited them, and the history books are drenched in these betrayals. The Sengoku period, often romanticized as a time of heroic warfare, was in fact a blood-soaked free-for-all of shifting alliances, double-crosses, and power grabs. Samurai pledged loyalty with one hand and drew the blade with the other. Take the infamous betrayal of Oda Nobunaga by Akechi Mitsuhide. Nobunaga was a powerful warlord on the brink of unifying Japan. Mitsuhide was his trusted general. That is, until Mitsuhide turned on him and led a surprise attack at Honnoji Temple, where Nobunaga was forced to commit seppuku as his temple burned around him. Mitsuhide's betrayal shocked the nation, but it wasn't rare. It was just the most famous example in a long line of backstabbing among the warrior elite. Loyalty, in the end, wasn't about personal honor. It was about survival and advantage. Samurai were political tools and their so-called honor code bent with the wind. Lords used them as pawns in deadly games of chess, and when a piece outlived its usefulness, it was sacrificed without hesitation. Entire clans were wiped out not in battle, but through betrayals sealed behind closed doors. A samurai could spend his whole life serving faithfully, only to be executed on suspicion of treason, real or imagined. Even within clans, there was no guarantee of safety. Brothers turned against each other, sons killed fathers, retainers poisoned their lords, all in the name of power. Trust was a myth. Paranoia was standard. Loyalty was demanded but rarely rewarded. And yet, every betrayal was cloaked in the language of duty and honor. That's the true irony. They killed each other for loyalty's sake, So the next time someone talks about samurai loyalty as noble, remember, in reality, it was a thin veil covering a brutal system of manipulation, control, and ruthless political survival. Loyalty wasn't sacred. It was weaponized, and it often killed the very people who tried to uphold it. When we talk about samurai, we usually imagine noble warriors riding into battle, defending the weak, and upholding justice. But from the perspective of the average medieval Japanese peasant, the samurai weren't saviors. They were a nightmare in armor. For the common folk, samurai were not romanticized heroes. They were armed tax collectors, violent enforcers, and symbols of oppression. Imagine trying to raise a family, till a rice field, or survive a drought while armored men rode through your village demanding grain, labor, or worse. The samurai were above the law, and their swords guaranteed obedience. If a peasant couldn't pay taxes or was accused of being disrespectful, it wasn't a court date they received. It was a beating, a beheading, or their home being burned to the ground, as an example to others. These warriors operated in a society where the class system was brutally rigid. Peasants were viewed as necessary but expendable, little more than tools for feeding the elite. During the Edo period, there was even a law that permitted samurai to kill any commoner who failed to show proper respect, a practice known as kirisute gomen. That means if you didn't bow low enough, speak humbly enough, or move out of the way fast enough, a samurai could legally draw his sword and cut you down in the street and walk away with no consequences. And it wasn't just about physical violence. The economic pressure placed on farmers and laborers by the warrior class was suffocating. Peasants were forced to hand over huge portions of their harvests as tax, often leaving them with barely enough to survive. Famines didn't just happen because of bad weather. They happened because samurai lords refused to reduce tax demands even when there wasn't enough food. Starving to death wasn't a natural tragedy. It was the direct result of policies enforced by the very warriors that history now idolizes. Wartime made it even worse. When rival samurai clans fought, their armies trampled through peasant villages, taking food, conscripting labor, and destroying homes. Women were often raped, men were killed or enslaved, children orphaned. Entire communities were wiped out, not by foreign invaders, but by the supposed protectors of the land. The samurai didn't shield the people from chaos. They were the source of it. And yet, because the samurai controlled the scribes, the art, and the history books, their legacy was rewritten. Instead of oppressors, they became paragons of virtue. The voice of the peasant was buried under ash, under sword, under silence. So before you put another samurai poster on your wall or watch another film romanticizing their code, ask yourself, who was holding the pen that wrote that history? Because from the ground up, the samurai era wasn't one of noble valor. It was a long, slow nightmare for the people who had no sword to draw and no name to remember. One of the most iconic and misunderstood elements of samurai culture is the practice of seppuku, or ritual suicide. It's often portrayed in films and pop culture as the ultimate act of honor, a noble warrior choosing death over disgrace, a solemn farewell wrapped in poetic dignity. But the reality is far darker. Seppuku wasn't just a personal choice. It was often a public performance demanded by those in power, used to maintain control, punish disobedience, or clean up political messes. And far from being peaceful, it was a grotesque, agonizing way to die. Picture this. A man kneels, dressed in white, in front of an audience. He takes a short blade and plunges it into his abdomen, slicing from left to right in a deliberate motion meant to disembowel him while fully conscious. Blood pours out, intestines spill. His face contorts in pain. He doesn't scream, because screaming would be dishonorable. Behind him stands another man, the Kaishakunin, who is tasked with ending his suffering by decapitating him at just the right moment. But the sword must not slice the head clean off. It must stop halfway through the neck, leaving the head dangling by a flap of skin, a gruesome symbol of restraint and precision. If the assistant botched it, the dishonor fell on him. This wasn't just a punishment. It was a spectacle. Feudal lords would order vassals to commit seppuku, not because they had done anything truly shameful, but because they had become inconvenient. A failed political alliance, a family falling out of favor, or even the whim of a more powerful daimyo could result in a command to die with honor. There was no appeal, no trial, no negotiation. You simply obeyed, or your entire family would suffer the consequences, and the pressure to comply didn't just come from superiors. It came from society itself. The Bushido Code, often romanticized today as a beautiful philosophy of warrior ethics, taught that death was preferable to shame, that loyalty to one's master was absolute, even unto death, that the ideal samurai should have no fear of dying, not in battle, not by execution, and not by his own hand. Death became the ultimate currency of virtue. Living was secondary. This glorification of death seeped into the identity of the entire warrior class. Samurai were taught to meditate on their own death daily, to visualize it, to welcome it, to believe that dying properly was more important than living well. What kind of society raises its children to see their own death as a desirable outcome? And let's not forget, this didn't stay contained within the medieval era. The toxic worship of self-sacrifice and death over disgrace would echo centuries later in the fanaticism of World War II's kamikaze pilots, whose spiritual lineage traces back to the same samurai ideal. Die for honor, for loyalty, for glory. So the next time someone praises seppuku as a noble tradition, ask yourself, is it truly noble to turn pain into theater, to turn fear into duty, to turn death into performance? Or is it just another way a culture used idealism to mask the cruelty of control? When people talk about the Edo period, the era between 1603 and 1868, it's often painted as a time of peace, cultural blossoming, and elegant refinement. No more brutal wars. No more clans slaughtering each other for power, just serene tea ceremonies, kabuki theater, and beautifully manicured gardens. A golden age of tranquility, or so the myth goes. But beneath the surface of this so-called peace was a suffocating regime of control, surveillance, class oppression, and cultural stagnation. The sword may have been sheathed, but the people was still bleeding, just more quietly. The Tokugawa shogunate ruled with an iron grip disguised as order. Yes, the endless clan warfare had stopped because the shogunate forced it to stop. Daimyo lords were required to spend every other year in the capital, Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and leave their wives and children behind as virtual hostages whenever they returned to their provinces. This system, called Sankin Kotai, wasn't just about logistics. It was psychological warfare. Behave or your family suffers. It bled the lords financially, kept them exhausted, and ensured none could build enough power to challenge the shogunate. Peace was preserved, but only because rebellion had been economically and emotionally strangled. And the samurai, their golden age was over. No wars meant no glory. The warrior class bred for combat, was now out of a job. Many were forced to become bureaucrats, clerks, or errand boys. Imagine training your whole life to wield a katana with honor and precision, only to spend your days stamping documents and memorizing rice quotas. The warrior class didn't disappear, it decayed. Samurai wandered the cities, bored, bitter, and sometimes drunk. Their swords more for show than for battle. Some became ronin, masterless samurai, and turned to crime or became mercenaries. The peace they were living in was not noble. It was emasculating. Meanwhile, commoners, the farmers, artisans, and merchants, were trapped in a rigid caste system. Social mobility? Not even a dream. You were born into a class, and there you stayed. A merchant could be rich beyond belief, but he still ranked below a penniless samurai in status. The entire system was a Kafkaesque joke, where wealth didn't buy you respect, and being noble meant obeying rules you had no power to change. Surveillance was constant. Neighborhoods were organized into groups responsible for reporting each other's behavior. If someone in your group committed a crime or voiced dissent, everyone could be punished. People learned to keep their heads down, mouths shut, and dream small. Art flourished, but only within the boundaries allowed by the state. Books were censored, ideas were policed, individuality became dangerous. You could write a haiku about the changing seasons, but not about changing the system, and all of this repression was sold under the comforting label of peace. A peace bought with silence, a peace maintained by fear, a peace that allowed the elite to preserve their power while everyone else was expected to be grateful for their cage. So yes, the Edo period was peaceful. If you define peace as a quiet, controlled stagnation where the price of stability was the suffocation of human spirit, a society where the sword stopped swinging, not because it was no longer needed, but because it had already done its job, keeping everyone firmly in their place.